I apologize for that outburst at the end of the last part. I can't believe the people in this story apart from the Phantom Thieves. The Phantom Thieves and the Confidants, to be precise. Speaking of, this chapter is definitely turning out to be a wild ride, isn't it? The rain had grown worse. It drummed against their umbrellas like fingertips on a desktop. With that awful, anxious pall in the air, the sound felt anticipatory. A world impatient to end. The streets of Yongenjaya were abandoned, houses already shut tight against the night. But the windows of LeBlanc were still lit. They made their way to that glow, and paused before the door. Makoto elbowed her way to the front of the group and swung it open wide. Sojiro was behind the counter, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow, and a smoldering cigarette between his fingers. His frown was so deep, it seemed to pull his entire face away from the bone. He tapped one finger against the counter as they all trooped in, Akechi bringing up the rear, huddled behind Haru and Yusuke. When the door swung shut behind him, the bell jingled, and at that sound Akechi let out a muffled scream and spun on the spot, entire body quaking fierce enough to make his teeth chatter. Haru tried, ineffectually, to soothe him as Sojiro raised an eyebrow. Makoto shook her head and mouthed, "Later." "Morgana, Yusuke, could you stay down here with Futaba?" she said aloud. "I'll explain things to boss. On, take the suitcase. The rest of you bring him upstairs." The stairs creaked and groaned as they slouched their way up. On laid the suitcase on the table beside the stairwell, and they spread out around the room. Akechi near the middle, hand limp at his sides, looking at nothing, looking lost. Ryuji sat down hard on Akira's bed and bent over, digging at his scalp like he was trying to unearth wicked thoughts. No sound except the patter of rain on the window and the murmur of voices downstairs. "I'm gonna pick up the pieces and build a Lego house. I'm out of touch, I'm out of sight. I'm out of know when you're getting down. And none of all these things I've done, I think I love you better now." Sorry, it's been a long time since I've listened to that song. I've got to do so. I'm gonna listen to that song again sometime. But right now, now is not the time to be talking about music. Now is the time to be reading this story and finishing it all the way through, like I promised I would. Did I promise? I said I would, not promise. I don't want to be the man who makes promises that he can't keep. "Can he sit down or something?" Ryuji asked without looking up. "He's creeping me out." Haru laid her hands on his shoulders and guided him to the sofa. He obediently folded his body into a sitting position and rested his hands on his knees. Stiff and somehow childish, like he'd gotten caught roughhousing and brought to the principal's office. He looked too young and verging on some age that had never been. They said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They dispersed around the room, keeping a safe distance from Akechi, until the voices downstairs ceased. The front door swung open and shut. The stairs creaked, 2 by 2, and Makoto's and Yusuke's heads surfaced from the stairwell. They leaned against the table as Morgana bounded up and sat between them. Makoto's arms crossed, her nails pushed hard into the skin. It didn't go well. "He can stay here," Makoto said. "For how long, I have no idea. I think boss agreed mostly because he didn't have the energy to argue. That's probably going to change tomorrow. Futaba has gone home, Yusuke added. Does anyone have a preferred course of action at this time? We need to get some sleep before we draw up any strategies, An said. Haru nodded, and it took visible effort for her to raise her head again. All of us are exhausted. I doubt any plans we lay now would be constructive ones. Her voice turned severe. Especially you, Yusuke. Have you eaten at all today? I will be fine. How many times have people told you to open your mouth and shove some food down your shed? Yusuke Kitagawa. No wonder people on YouTube think you're always hungry. You will not be fine. Eat when you get home, please. He looked away from her stare. Yes, of course. If you don't have any ingredients at home, then... If you have enough money, then you can just get yourself a takeout. But then, you need to go shopping for ingredients. The art supplies could wait, alright? Alright. At this point, Akira's symptoms will no doubt have come to resemble those of the other paranoia syndrome victims, Morgana said. Even if his hospital tries to cover that up, we all know why it's urgent to save him as soon as possible. And that's to say nothing of how precarious the situation is for the rest of society. If Akechi's earlier theory is correct, the number of victims will increase exponentially until our enemy is dealt with. We absolutely cannot afford to drag our feet on this one. At least tomorrow's Sunday, said An. We can come here without having to worry about school. Then we can put our heads together and figure out something. Anything. I can bring us back to the Dead Sea if necessary, but I wouldn't recommend it without a plan. If nothing else, our enemy has proven himself to be extremely proficient at setting up ambushes down there. Akechi. It was Makoto who'd said his name. All heads turned to her, except Akechi's own. He kept staring hollowly at the far wall. We'll need you to contribute as well, she continued. You've already provided one valuable theory about paranoia syndrome spread. Any intelligence you have to offer about the Dead Sea or our target could be helpful. Agreed, said Yusuke. We could benefit from that perspective. Even though Akira may have been temporarily abducted, Ryuji raised his head and looked at Akechi, and his stare was flat and dull. It should have been you. Ryuji! An snapped. Haru clapped a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. What? It's what we're all thinking. Might as well clear the air, right? Ryuji is going to snap. This is not the time to start fights, Sakamoto, Morgana said, hackles rising. Am I the only one who saw it? That son of a bitch with the sack over his head faked us all out back there. He only pretended to grab this piece of shit so he could get at Akira. I should have reacted faster. Should have just held him back. And let Akechi get dragged under? Makoto asked. Her voice had gone dangerously soft. No one would have missed him. No one would have given a shit. Everyone who ever pretended to care about him either died or tried to kill him first. Akira would have made us bail him out anyway, because that's just the kind of guy he is. But I ain't gonna pretend he did anyone a favor sacrificing himself for this scumbag. Akechi kept staring forward, blank-faced, and Ryuji's eye twitched, and he stood and advanced on him. Hey, murderer! You got anything to fucking say? No one saw Makoto move, but suddenly she was behind Ryuji, grasping his wrist. Her grip was gentle, but the way she held him and the tenor of her voice suggested that, If he attempted any sudden movements, it would rapidly tighten to an excruciating degree. "Ryuji," she said, "go home." He looked at her, then at the others. None of them would meet his eye. He grit his teeth and threw off her hand and stomped down the stairs. The door jingled open and slammed shut. After a long moment, An said, "The moron forgot his umbrella." Makoto sighed. "An, could you—" "Yeah, on it. See you tomorrow, everyone." "I'm going to stay with the Sakuras," Morgana said as she left. "Futaba will probably have to use my face as a stress ball again." "Sorry, Morgana." "All part of the job. Bright and early tomorrow, okay?" He bounded away. Haru and Yusuke muttered their goodbyes and made for the stairs. And then it was just Makoto and Akechi and the gossiping rain. She fought for something to say to him. Nothing seemed adequate. He might have killed over 30 people and attempted to kill her and her friends as well, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that the person sitting in front of her now was just some rough mannequin sculpted in that pitiable maniac's image. Neither his face nor his posture had changed during Ryuji's rant. After a year in that waterlogged wasteland, the Dead Sea seemed to have drained away everything vibrant and alive from Akechi as well. Or maybe, and she shuddered a little at the thought, this was who he'd always been. Under the layers of affectation, the preening talk show darling and the sneering assassin in every role in between, was someone colorless as empty as a discarded bottle. "We'll be back tomorrow," was all she could think to tell him. "Mr. Sakura will likely open up shop before we arrive. I strongly recommend against leaving this building in the meantime." He stirred at that. She could almost hear the tendons in his neck creak as he turned to face her. When he spoke, his voice was a croaking whisper. "Where would I go?" he asked. There was no answer for that. All she could manage was, "Get some rest, Akechi." Makoto felt palpable relief as she stepped out of the cafe and into the rain, the release of some unseen hand tightening over her chest. She looked up and into the square of some soft, buttery light from the attic window. After a minute, it went out, leaving the shopfront darkened and blind as the rest of the street. She turned and walked off, footsteps fading until the sound of the rain overwhelmed everything. The worst has come to pass. The cold steel cell and the ceaseless mosquito whine. The deep blue glow and the many-eyed shadows. The box in which he was imprisoned had begun to rot. Chunks of metal peeled away like scabs to reveal the bars of his old cage underneath. He curled up on the ground and said nothing. The one who put his soul at hazard to banish the malevolent paranoia from this world has been claimed by it. Igor's voice was grave. And so the evil festering within the sea of souls is allowed to run rampant. It's time, in time, its influence shall lead to the same ruin that was so recently averted. Such a dismal turn of events. Still, all is not yet lost. I shall continue to believe in mankind's indomitable spirit. It must be so easy for you, Akechi said. I beg your pardon? Locked away nice and safe in this place, waxing poetic about humanity and its future. You're nothing but an audience to it. If all of us went extinct tomorrow, you wouldn't be affected in the least. He looked away from those shadows, buried his face in his knees. Your voice irritates me. Well, well, Igor said mildly. I do not believe a guest has ever judged me so harshly. But I cannot dispute your claim. Apart from the occasional visitor to the Velvet Room, I stand forever apart from the affairs of man. And I must admit, it causes me a certain amount of distress to be so detached from the company of others. A position, I believe, with which you may sympathize. Akechi didn't answer. Observe this room, the chamber of your soul, a cell hanging in the center of all, always of you and the others, always witnessed, and yet always apart. You crave the attention of others, so why do you shy away from their gaze? Imprisoned by your lack of bonds, seeking connections but scorning companions, in search of validation from the society you once sought to unmake. It would appear that your very heart is plagued by paradox. I'm afraid I'm not nearly as complex as you would like to believe. I don't care about any of them. I couldn't if I tried. So you say. But the evidence tells a different story. Your cage continues to expand and fragment, though it leaves you ever more vulnerable to these judging eyes. The fate of the world is unclear, but your rehabilitation continues apace. Igor drummed on his desk, humming tunelessly to himself. I shall persevere, if only to see through your time in this Velvet Room. I find you quite fascinating. I'm flattered to hear that someone does. There you go, he said brightly. You act as though your spirit is broken, and yet you are quite able to muster up sarcasm. More evidence of that unyielding human will. Akechi raised his head, stood up, tried to see Igor through the holes and cracks in his cell. It was no use. Even though weak blue light leaked into the box from a dozen places, he still couldn't find a hole that let him peer down at the floor below. As he strained to see, pain flared in his head, fierce enough to nearly bring him to his knees again. That silver spike, that fragmented shine in the distance. Even here it followed him. That light now seemed almost tangible. He saw it in the cell on the far wall, still bobbing up and down. Strangely, the darkness in that cell had shifted, retreating so far from that hallucinatory wisp that shadows were almost climbing the walls. Igor continued to speak, apparently heedless to all of this. An invitation once given is never rescinded. During your imprisonment in the Sea of Souls, it was the influence of this Velvet Room that allowed you to survive. Your essence, preserved here in stasis, shielding your mind from the sea's pernicious aura of decay. And now, though the hour is dark and the future is dim, you have broken free of those corrupted waters. If you wish to see your rehabilitation through, then hold on to the bonds you have found. Those liberating shackles, though they may remain weak and may burn to the touch. Hollow you might be, but your potential is undeniable. He chuckled. Who knows what can be hidden within the fortress of the heart? In the waning dark of his cell, Akechi's eyes widened. The fortress! Our time is at an end. When dawn breaks, you will face unexpected challenges. I trust you will rise to the occasion magnificently. He felt lightheaded, sleep rushing in to claim him. As he curled up again in his cell, he held on to Igor's words, desperately, before they crumbled apart in his mind like any other dream. The rise of Goro Akechi starts now. The worst has come to pass. His last memories were cold. The water rushing in, and those chains so frigid that they bit at him like teeth, gnawing through his flesh and into the muscle and bone. Now the water was gone, but the cold remained. He jerked in his seat from the sudden agony. The bus had stalled. Its engine was silent. Through that fogged glass, the driver sat idle and patient. And the chains had followed him here. They laced around his chair and looped around his limbs, his chest, his throat, drawing ever tighter so that he thought he could hear the cellophane crackle of his own cartilage yielding under their grip. Then they loosened, just enough for them to draw in a single whooping breath and cinch tight again. Lavenza sat across from him, hands in her lap. Her face was devoid of pity. You were warned about the danger you faced, and yet you cast yourself recklessly in harm's way. The enemy has triumphed. Paranoia runs amok. Now witness your punishment. You shall remain here to endure suffering without end until your feeble life is exhausted. This cold was almost alive. It stabbed him like needles, ever shifting in search of more vulnerable skin. He felt his windpipe bending like a straw. He couldn't even scream. It all felt very familiar. Lavenza blinked once, slowly. Akira's grimace of pain had twisted sideways. His labored, tortured breathing acquired an odd syncopation. Are you laughing? Here we are again, he wheezed. The chains seized again, but he just grinned wider. Sorry, everyone. I just keep messing up. Even now you do not despair, said Lavenza. She sounded in awe. I am curious as to why. Akira's eyes rolled to her. Did you forget? I've been here before. He gripped the arms of his chair and fought against the chain's grip, struggling to lean forward. His ribs creaked and his throat burned, and his arms felt like they would shatter to splinters. But they gave way. A fraction of an inch, but they gave way. Then he let go, and they pulled him into the plush of the seat once again. Been here before, he said, between rasping breaths. And just like before, I know what'll happen. My friends will come for me. She blinked again. Her lids were slightly out of sync, as if she couldn't quite figure out how their movement worked. Her smile, too, showed very little warmth. That lineless doll's face didn't allow for it. But she nevertheless appeared to be making an effort. We shall see. If you truly believe that all is not yet lost, then keep your spirit burning bright. Remember, I will remain at your side. Akira managed that cocky grin for a moment longer. Then the chain spasmed again and dropped him back into that icy and hungering pain. The bus dissolved and swam before his eyes, until he was lost in a blue haze. The smoldering topaz of Levenz's eyes gleamed. It seemed to recede until it was as distant as the stars. And then the chain's gnashing grew louder and louder until it filled his whole world. And once again, the fire has been lit underneath me to see this story through to the end. When this is finished, I'll have something to talk with you guys about. But until that moment, I'm the Masked Ranger saying, keep moving forward, remember the oath, and Iago, sooner or later, your ass is grass. Ciao!